economic rent. So no, this isn't about the rent that you would pay for an apartment, but in fact it's looking at rent for a factor of production, such as land, labor, or capital. So economic rent is just the extra payment that's received for the good, such as land, that does not change the amount of the factor that is supplied. Or we could say for labor too. It's the money that's above the wages that you would have been willing to work for. It's not, and then just because you get paid more doesn't mean that you're supplying more. This is looking at land, which would be fixed, 1,000 acres of land that maybe you have, and there's original demand for it. Well, what if you were willing to sell for 2,000, but then the demand went up to maybe $4,000? So now you got $4,000 for that land that you would have been willing to sell for 2,000. What would your economic rent be? Or one way of thinking about it is what would your surplus be? Remember consumer surplus and producer surplus? Kind of the same thing, but now we're talking again on the factor or resource market side. Well, it'd be $2,000, 4,000 minus $2,000. You don't have to write this slide down as well, but I think this is, at least for me, the easiest way I can think of economic rent. And I can think about professional athletes. You think about Joe Mauer and Adrian Peterson or Kevin Love or Zach Parise, and all of them probably really love their sport. And if they had to play for less, they probably would do it. So let's just throw out a number. Let's say Kevin Love is making $10 million a year. Maybe he would be willing to work for $6 million a year. Well, again, he would have economic rent of $4 million then. It's what he is getting paid minus what he's willing to work for. Maybe some of you guys are making economic rent at your jobs. If you're working at Subway, let's say, and you're making $10 an hour as a part time manager there, but you'd be willing to make $8 because you love being a sandwich artist, you now have consumer surplus of $2. And it doesn't mean that you're supplying anymore. That supply is fixed. And you're only the same person. Joe Mauer, even if he gets more money on that crazy contract that's paying him $25 million a year, he still doesn't produce any more. In fact, some might say he produces less. But that's another point. On to the last topic then. We've talked about factors of production and how many people to hire, and we've talked about economic rent. Now we're going to talk a little bit about wages. Here you see kind of a funny word. It's said monopsony. Again, similar to a monopoly, but now we are looking at hiring inputs rather than making a product. So a monopsony is a market structure in which there's only a single buyer of a good, service, or resource. So they're the only ones really hiring in that area. You can think of a big manufacturing company in a small town. They might have a monopsony. If you remember in a monopoly, the demand curve or the price was greater than the marginal revenue product itself. And so here, when we're looking at the supply side, we're dealing with marginal resource cost instead of marginal revenue. So here the marginal resource cost is higher than what the wage rate is in a monopsony. And below it just talks about how to avoid wage differentials in the same job, monopsonists must pay a uniform wage to all workers. This means that the cost of an extra worker, the marginal resource cost, is the sum of that worker's wage rate and the amount necessary to bring that wage rate of all current workers up to that new wage level. The MRC curve lies above the supply curve, just like the marginal revenue curve lied below the demand curve. Here, the marginal resource cost or the marginal resource curve lies above the supply curve. Also, we notice that the monopsonists will hire a quantity of labor where the MRC equals MRP, but using the labor supply curve as their price. So go ahead and draw that graph that you have there. And it's not real fancy or anything, but you have the supply curve and then the marginal revenue product curve. And you have the WC, and that's for the competitive market, and the QC, which is for the competitive quantity. For a monopsony, again, the marginal resource cost curve is above the supply curve, and therefore they are going to produce where MRC equals MRP. That's how many people that they will hire at that QM for a monopsony. However, their wage goes down to the supply curve and over to the left. And so that's why that's WM for a monopsony. So you can see that they're going to hire less workers at a lower wage than what it would be in a competitive market. I think you can probably see some parallels there to what a monopoly would be in the product market. But now we're just talking about a monopsony. Finally, the last thing that we'll look at for wages is concerning unions. And so unions kind of act as a monopoly as well as they try to make it all those thousands of employees as one. So they attempt to monopolize the sale of labor. And here you can see a simple supply and demand graph. And again, I couldn't even really find a good one to show you. I actually made this one up. But you see the marginal revenue product in the supply curve and where a competitive market would be. You see where the monopsony would be. And now you can take a look at where the union would be. And so for a union, the wages are going to be where the marginal resource cost equals the marginal revenue product. And then that's also where the quantity of people will be hired. And so you can notice those three different things on the graph. They're all probably pretty important to know. No doubt they'll be on the test. Where is the monopsony going to set their wages at? Where is a competitive market going to set their wages at? And where is the union going to set their wages at? And then the quantity of labor that's hired, how much is going to be hired. So that really concludes our lesson for today. A ton of information. Maybe some of you guys divide this into two parts, and that's probably a good idea. And I have one more slide after this that just compares monopsony and monopoly, if that helps at all. By the way, if I haven't shown the Newsies clips on unions, you should ask me to do that tomorrow. We should make some time. There's always time for a good musical.